Adam Boulton, welcome to Chat Politics. You've interviewed every Prime Minister, I think, since Alec Douglas-Home. So who of those has been the nation's best leader?
Well, I mean, I should say I've interviewed all of them, but not all when they were Prime Minister. I think the first Prime Minister in office I interviewed was Margaret Thatcher. So really, if you're talking about Douglas-Home, he took over in the early 60s, you're pretty much talking about my lifespan. So when you talk about who was the remarkable Prime Minister, you're really talking about, if you like, the national story of the last 50 years or so, and who was significant. And I think it's pretty clear that if one had to pick out three names there, you'd probably pick out Harold Wilson, you'd pick out Tony Blair, and you'd pick out Margaret Thatcher as people who were transformative. You could say that Britain was very different.
Indeed, what I'm trying to get at is who changed it in the most positive way for you?
I'm not really sure that's the
it's the right question.
The job of journalists. What the job of journalists is to talk about who's had the greatest impact and what the implications of that are. I mean, one name who's not on that list of the top three, if you like, is Ted Heath, but arguably, by being the Prime Minister who managed to take Britain into the European Union, he was truly a transformative. I think what one would say is that in the case of Margaret Thatcher, there was, you're all too young to remember it, but I mean, there was certainly a feeling of national decline, that in a sense the purpose of being in government was to cling to the wreckage, as put, and no one really had an answer to the decline of the manufacturing sector. And Britain appeared to be losing a lot of its influence in the world. Now, during that Thatcher period, certainly that view was turned round. Of course, it had very big downsides, the brutality of the deindustrialization, the loads of money culture. So that, I think, would, I think she was important, if you like, to keep Britain on the road. But equally, if you look at the period of the Blair government, you can see lots of continuities from the Conservative period. But what you can also say is that the notion that there was no such thing as society, that the job of the individual was simply to look after themselves or their family, was pretty much abandoned, in as much as Tony Blair and his government managed to bring in some quite significant social transformations on things like homosexuality and elsewhere. They also managed to persuade the middle classes to pay more tax in support of things like the health service and the education system. So that was fairly transformative. But equally, you can look at a Prime Minister like John Major, obviously back in the news at the moment, and say that the change in Britain would not have been possible if he hadn't been in power for 7 years, that the Labour government of 1992 was pretty much tied into reversing Thatcherism, whereas by the time that you got around to Tony Blair in 1997, he was really committed to building on it.
Who was the most interesting Prime Minister then you interviewed, the most interesting character?
I think, generally speaking, if you get to the top, you are interesting, and generally speaking, you carry some baggage with you. Oddly, I wouldn't particularly say that I find any of the current main party leaders particularly interesting. I think. Would
you pick out one or two though who stood out?
I mean, for me, starting out in the early 80s as a political correspondent, Margaret Thatcher, of course, was absolutely mesmerising, not just because you'd sort of grown up hearing both sides on such a divisive figure, but because, she was a woman in a man's world. But the thing about Margaret Thatcher, until the latter stages of her premiership, was that she had no sense of people's status. I mean, the fact that I was, spotty 23-year-old just out of university didn't really bother her. If you asked her a question, she would engage with it and she would try to answer it. She wasn't a person who had a line to take or regarded an interview basically as a defensive exercise. She had a mind that wanted to argue, that wanted to be engaged. And so, again, from the perspective of a journalist, that was fantastic. And she didn't care that, you didn't work for the hallowed BBC or whatever.
I think your father was a doctor, but from a very young age, I think you decided to pursue a completely different career path in the form of broadcasting. So what attracted you to journalism?
Well, it wasn't a young age. I was bullied into doing science A-levels, so I only switched really when I went on to read English at university.
Bullied into it?
Well, yeah, pretty much. I mean, my father wanted me to be a doctor, and unfortunately, I wasn't so bad at science that it didn't look credible that I could study it. But
Was it difficult breaking that news that you just didn't really want to?
Yeah, it was very difficult. I mean, it was. I had a pretty confrontational relationship with my father. Yeah. But anyway, so I think the reason why I was interested in journalism was that I felt that I was interested in lots of diverse things. I had the capacity to follow them and sort of grasshopper type of mind. I knew I was quite successful academically, but I knew I didn't have that sort of focus that you probably need to be a top academic. And also I was always interested in the power of the broadcast media, I think, and in particular when it came to politics. I like the idea that in this country it's a non-partisan medium to work in, that you don't have to take sides or editorialise. That struck me as I suppose halfway between academia and true politics, if you like.
You played a key role in establishing Sky's politics team. What's its biggest challenge at the moment?
Well, I think the biggest challenge in broadcasting in Britain is always the same, and it's to compete credibly with the BBC, because the BBC is a massively well-funded organisation which doesn't have to worry where its next penny is coming from, and it has a august history and a set of values. And I think that if you're working in broadcast journalism or other areas of broadcast, it makes it much more difficult commercially to be successful, and it also provides a pretty high standard to compete with.
Talking of the BBC, I think it was Ed Balls who said that it's fought to be fair and balanced, whereas Sky News perhaps has become partisan. So how would you respond to those people who suggest that Sky News has, and I assume he's meaning that it's become right-wing in the last decade. So
well, I think he said that at election time.
Right, so how would you respond to those people?
And at election time, politicians have got a job to do, which is to win their elections, and so they say things. I think he subsequently withdrew that comment. But certainly, as everyone knows, I had a row with Alastair Campbell. I mean, I always say this, I think that we're all subject, BBC, ITV, Channel 4, Sky, to the same regulatory environment, and we're all meant to be properly balanced and impartial, and I think by and large we all do. And in our case, of course, all the non-BBC channels, we're held up to the mark by Ofcom, by an independent regulator, and ultimately we can lose our licence to broadcast if we breach those rules. So I certainly reject any notion that we are biased, but I think that every organisation has an institutional bias. And I think the BBC is effectively a public service, is effectively an organisation which spends taxpayers' money. So I think it has an instinctive sympathy with things like the National Health Service and the state education system and those set of values which are predominantly associated with the centre-left, if you like.
Thus, it shouldn't be blamed.
Well, I just think it's a fact of life.
Right.
What I think Sky offers, and I think the same is true of ITV, is that we come out of a tradition, a commercial tradition, a business tradition, so that whereas in a sense on the BBC instinctively profit is a dirty word because they are non-profit organisations, we I think regard business as being a perfectly legitimate activity and don't regard profit as being a dirty word. We're perhaps readier to question the absolute authority of public provision, to say, well, actually, you know, is the health service doing a good job? You know, would you be better off sending a child to private school or whatever? I don't think we're pro-private school, but I think we're more open in that area. And I think that does mean that if you believe that there is a kind of chattering class liberal consensus, I don't think we're in any sense biased, but I don't think we buy into that to the same extent. And I think, you know, the same can be said to a certain extent of ITV, that because historically we have a closer relationship with Fleet Street, just as ITV does, that, you know, big figures in print journalism have come into ITV and certainly a lot of print journalists have come into Sky, that while we don't share the agenda of those newspapers, we perhaps have an attitude which is less sort of internal re-education as the BBC does, and more of a you know, dog and lamppost type relationship between the journalist and the subject.
So that market in news stories, then, it's like any other market in that it's driven by supply and demand. So doesn't that mean that some of the least worthwhile stories, do you think, become the most covered?
I think you have to be very careful saying a story is worthwhile and another story isn't worthwhile. I think one of the things that we've always done on Sky is we have had a very strong political team. We now have a strong economics team, business team. We've built up our foreign bureau, but we've never been shy about doing murder stories or you know, sensationalist stories. And I think that actually serves the viewer well. I think it gives them a good mix. In fact, I've had, you know, people say to me, well, I love Sky because you know, I know that I'm not going to miss anything juicy, but I will get a quality of journalism on the serious subject. So I don't think in television that kind of notion of, you know, tabloid and broadsheet really applies to the same extent.
So it's about getting the balance right.
Yeah, I mean, I can remember in the 90s, BBC political producers saying, oh God, you know, why are you spending so much time covering Tory Eurosceptics? You know, that's just Murdoch, isn't it? And I said, no, it's not Murdoch. I said, you know, the reason why we're covering them is because I think they're going to tear the Tory party apart, which of course has been going on ever since. Similarly, that same BBC senior producer, who strangely enough went on to work for the Labour Party, also said to me, you know, why are you covering the Greens so heavily this year? And I said, well, you know, they got 16% in the European elections. He said, what did you put in your package today? And I said, we put in the speakers of the Greens. Yes, you know, she's not the sort of calibre of the person we'd put on the 6 o'clock news. I personally don't think you need to make, or should make in the news business, you should make that type of judgment. If you think it's interesting, you think it's pertinent, I think you should put it on. And, you know, fact of the matter is, things that we've done, you know, like Madeleine McCann, like the various American trials, the OJ trial and all that, you know, what tends to happen is our competitors first of all sneer and then they copy us.
What has Leveson taught us, in your view? And if you can sum it up, what do you think we should take from it?
I think if we get to the root of this, there was a feeling that the press in particular and the Murdoch empire had become too powerful. And although I regard, in my personal experience, Rupert Murdoch's contribution as, enabling, because I can't think of many other people who would have funded Sky News in the way that he has done over 25 years. I can recognise that there were some issues which needed to be sorted out. The law was broken, and I've never heard any journalists, inside or outside the organisation, say that if people break the law, they shouldn't face the consequences. And I think it was right that there should have been a national conversation at the Leveson inquiry about the way the press was behaving and the way the balance was. Where I part company with Leveson, and I did say this when I gave evidence at Leveson, was that I don't see a need to change the law. I mean, I think that, whatever it is, 60 journalists have been subjected to dawn raids, people are on trial, they're facing heavy sentences. The News International was frustrated in its attempts to merge with B-Sky B. Millions of pounds were lost, millions of pounds have been paid in compensation, all without Leveson doing anything. And I think, personally, to change the notion of the free press, which does date back to the English Civil War, is a big mistake. I think I come from a regulated sector of the news business, but I don't think that means everybody needs to be regulated. And I think the newspapers having rights of freedom of speech, which frankly we don't have, is healthy for British democracy.
Moving on to a different point, when you conducted an interview with George W. Bush and his wife Laura, what was the most interesting part that you noticed of their relationship? Is it an equal one?
Yeah, I mean, that was quite interesting because Bush wanted to do it with his wife, and the American embassy were very keen that we were going to do it. But we said okay, and by that stage she'd been First Lady for 5-6 years, so I thought it was perfectly legitimate. But they expected that where I did the interview, I'd pretty much ignore her. Because when they tried to do joint interviews in America, that tended to be what happens. Oh, we're joined by the President, Mrs. Bush, and he talks to the President and then says to Mrs. Bush, thank you very much for being with us, and that's it. Whereas I thought actually it was more interesting, bear in mind that Bush was quite a familiar person, to see the interplay between them. And when I asked her, what she thought about his kind of language of, wanted dead and alive and all that, and he sort of volunteered that she thought it was pretty stupid and all of that. I think that interplay, was very interesting, and I felt, the time of the interview was also interesting in as much as, he's in his second term, but clearly, knew how unpopular that he was in Britain and Europe, but wanted to try and redress that, and saw Laura Bush as one of the ways of doing it.
In this country then, you said, I think just before hosting Sky's 2010 leaders debate between Gordon Brown, David Cameron and Nick Clegg, that I've got written down here, if the debates are about me, then I have failed humiliatingly. So how did you prepare for that debate?
Well, we did a lot of work to bring the debates about, but that's another story. I think we at Sky, subsequently watching the 3 debates, I think we prepared more intensively than any of the other networks, in as much as once the broadcasters and the politicians had agreed the rules, we looked at them very carefully and said, well, how can we make the most compelling television out of this? So that, for example, there was a rule which said that, we did the timings, worked out you could probably have 8 questions, that was it. The ruling said the maximum was that 4 questions could come from members of the public who didn't live within a 30-mile radius of the venue. So we polled our viewers, but we also, you know, one of the weaknesses in the debate system was that although people were intensely interested in them, the rules said that the audience, or the people asking the questions, the only people allowed in the room, had to be from a 30-mile radius of the venue. They had to be a representative sample in terms of age, race, blah, blah, blah. And so that meant that rather than being people who wanted to be there, they were people that the independent company who assembled the audience had to seek out and ask to come to the debate, right? And then on top of that, 4 of the questions had to come from that group, a lot of whom thought they were doing you a big enough favour by coming in the first place, right? And when you contact them and said, well, do you want to ask a question? And so we just worked very, very hard to get a panel of what we thought in our area of foreign affairs were decent, and we worked hard both with the but we, you know, it was quite clear in the rules that we weren't allowed to suggest questions or anything else like that. And so we spent a lot of time on the questions, and we also spent a lot of time on the design of it to get me with my back to the audience, facing them, which obviously was a way of sort of slightly downplaying my role. And I think, you know, and
do you know who initially suggested that?
Me. Was
it you?
Yeah. Because on the basis, because I'd seen how American presidential debates were done.
Right, so you did a lot of research into
Yeah. And it, you know, I felt it worked very well. ITV didn't really plan it. They just put the 3 at the podium, so you hardly saw poor old Alastair Stewart at all. He was sort of down on the floor. Whereas the BBC did the more traditional 3 podiums in a row and then 1 off to the left. But we found a cockpit at the Arnolfini Centre, spent a lot of time designing it, and so most of the images you see of the leaders' debates, except for the one with them all with their feet in the air, tend to come from the Sky debate, because we really focused on making sure that it had impact.
So in that 2010 election, on that results night, I think Ofcom received over 700 complaints with your infamous live on air dispute with Alastair Campbell.
Oh, right, we've got to be clear about this.
Yes.
That wasn't election night.
It wasn't. Of course, it wasn't. No. It was afterwards, wasn't it?
Yeah, but there were 2 complaints about me during the election.
Right.
One was from the debate, which was that, perfectly within the rules, I asked Nick Clegg a follow-up question, because that day the Telegraph and the Mail had done what they hoped were very damaging stories about him, and I asked him to comment on them. The Campbell thing happened during the period when, after the inconclusive election, the negotiations were going on between the parties.
That's it. So how many days after election night was this?
Monday. It was the Monday night.
Right, okay.
And the government was eventually formed. Should know this, I wrote a book about it. It was I think, filmed on the Tuesday afternoon.
Okay.
But what I should say is, in both cases, Ofcom said that it wasn't their responsibility to rule on it, but since they've been asked, they would make a ruling, and in both cases they ruled 100% in my favour.
Indeed, but it doesn't stop the fact that there's 700 people. Does that, you know, did that affect you at all?
Well, in a sense, you know, I mean, you don't want to set out to annoy people, but you do want to have them engaged.
Yeah.
And, you know, one of the interesting things about covering an election is people's partisan hackles are up, right? So if you appear to land a blow on one of their own, they immediately assumed you're biased and you support the other side. Whereas in fact, I suspect most journalists, and certainly me, want to ask testing questions of of all the parties. So in a sense, it proves that you struck home. I mean, the Campbell business, was extraordinary because I lost my temper, but Campbell and I have known each other for a long time. Basically, if you read the transcript, he is losing the argument and therefore says, right, I know how to try and get back, I'll try and wind Adam up and get him cross. He did it by attacking my integrity and the integrity of Sky News, because he knew that was something I cared about. And I should not have got annoyed, but actually I don't regret anything I said.
How many times have you watched and re-watched that clip?
Not a great deal.
No? And on your quote, of course not about, not before that encounter, but about the election debate, that it shouldn't be all about yourself. That, of course, was about you. So that wasn't humiliating.
It was, actually. I mean, I don't think that was humiliating. Well, listen, first of all, the debates, because of the rules, you were much more circumscribed than you normally are as a journalist. I mean, to put it at its crudest, most of my job is asking questions. In the debates, as a moderator of the debates, you can't even ask questions, right? So
there's the difference.
So that's what I was trying to say.
Okay.
And what I was trying to say was it was designed to be this opportunity to hit a really mass audience, give them the choice between the politicians, and that therefore any coat trailing by the moderators I really felt was inappropriate, and I don't think I did that, nor do I think Alastair Stewart and David Dimbleby did that. Normally, however, the job of a journalist, I mean, your first job is to attract the attention of the audience, so that does mean that you have to play devil's advocate. You do have to ask questions that that some of your interviewees might find offensive. There are different ways of doing it. You can try and be deliberately offensive, or you can try and be a bit more insidious.
Which is most enjoyable of the two?
Well, my style is Jeremy Paxman has made a kind of theatre out of being contemptuous. My style is more to try and coax people that I understand their position, to get them to commit themselves. So in that sense, it's more insidious. But I mean, I think the point is that with political interviewing, a lot of the people who are interviewing politicians are, they do lots of interviews in a week. They get interviewed a lot, and so they have their techniques, their lines to take. Sometimes they want to do an interview and they want to get their face on screen, but they don't want to say anything interesting. So your job as an interviewer is to somehow get under their skin, to say something to them in such a way that they tell you, and more importantly tell the viewer, something more than when the viewer turned on the TV. Yeah.
You've been described by Andrew Marr as quite rare, in the sense that I think he says you're genuinely and thoroughly neutral. So is it that you just can't decide between the political parties, or that you simply have no opinions on current politics?
Well, as I say, I've chosen to work in the medium of television, and to me, I see myself as a conduit between the public and the politicians. I've never been tempted to take sides, and I can very often see both sides of an argument. So, I think my job is to test those, or all three sides of an argument. And what I believe in, if you like, is I believe in parliamentary democracy. I believe in a system where people elect representatives who then use their intelligence and their skill to take decisions, and most of the time I see my role as facilitating that. It's also true, in my opinion, others might not say this, but in my opinion, the more time you spend with politicians trying to understand politics and to interpret it, the more conflicted your own feelings become. I mean, there might be someone who, you know, personally quite like, would happily spend an evening with, who you think is foolish or dangerous in terms of the policies they're pursuing. Similarly, there might be someone who is, you know, obnoxious, arrogant, who appears to be onto something in terms of the policies they're putting forward. So for me, I mean, other journalists have different ideas. I mean, David Frost was similar to me. You know, if you're having to cross the lines all the time, deal with people from all different sides, I think the best way you can do it is by not making up your own mind about things, that always preserving that you know, that element of doubt.
Which interviewer do you most respect? Don't have to be alive now.
Well, I think, you know, there have been some greats. I mean, there's no doubt about it. Robin Day was a great interviewer. I think since his death, people have begun to reevaluate David Frost, and I think that he turned almost everything he did into an event, and I think he did get people to say things that they wouldn't have said elsewhere. I mean, I'm not as flamboyant as David, but I would see myself a bit in that tradition, I suppose. I mean, my sort of hero, my journalistic hero, a guy called Sam Donaldson, who was an American correspondent for a long time, who worked, as I do, both in the field and in the studio, which is sort of relatively rare. And in a sense, when I was sort of shaping what I wanted to do at Sky, I could see an opportunity to follow in his footsteps, but he would always be on the doorstep, always shouting questions, always trying to get an answer. And there was one famous moment where he always used to shout at Reagan, and Reagan had this habit of waiting till the helicopter blades were running, and so he'd come out, Sam shouted at him, and Reagan said, "Sorry, Sam, can't hear." But on one occasion he sort of shouted, "Hey, Mr. President." And to much to his surprise, Reagan came forward and said, "Yes, Sam, what is it?" And he realised he hadn't got a question. He was just going through the motions. And he said, "Where did you get those shoes?" But I think, you know, one of the things that's enjoyable about television journalism is doorstepping people, is trying to get a spontaneous reaction out of them.
And of course that brings something that perhaps they wouldn't say if
exactly. You know, "We are a grandmother," or you know, those famous off-the-cuff things. And of course, you know, one of the things that's happened over the 30 years I've been doing this job is that, you know, we've had the growth of the spin doctor and the media handler. So actually, a lot of effort is devoted to trying to take the spontaneity out of exchanges between interviewers and interviewee. You know, and you know, the most obvious way of doing it is just not to talk to people off the cuff. And if you're David Cameron, actually avoid sitting down, or indeed George Osborne, avoid sitting down for any kind of extended examination of where they are and what they believe.
Will Scotland, on a completely different note, will Scotland vote for independence, do you think?
Well, I can read the opinion polls like everybody else, and basically at the moment it's about, you know, 2/5 against, 1/5 for, and 2/5 up for grabs. So it could happen. I can certainly see a scenario in which it might happen. I think if, following the European elections, the government in Westminster sort of turns in on itself and starts talking about withdrawing from the EU and quarrelling and all that, I can see those Scots who haven't made up their mind thinking, well, I'm not that wild about independence, but I don't really compute what's happening in the south. You know, I think it makes absolute sense, if you have devolution, to have a strong regionalist party. whether you need to finally cross the line and find yourself on your own. We haven't really had that happen in Catalonia, and I certainly see that. I think Alex Salmond is the dominant Scottish politician of his generation, and he's a world-class politician. But on balance, there do seem to be more problems for the Scots going independent than not. But the answer is, I think it's an open contest at the moment.
Right. I think you've said that you don't vote and you prefer perhaps to spend polling day in bed. Is that correct?
Well, I don't vote, but I don't vote for the reasons we've already discussed. I don't vote either for Russell Brand's reason or for Jeremy Paxman's reasons. Yeah. I mean, I don't vote. I believe in the system, but I happen to think I've got a kind of sort of altar boy role in that system, and that can it gives me an opt-out. The reason why I spend polling day in bed is because normally once we start on the election night programme, I'm normally up for at least 24 hours and sometimes, best part of 48 hours. So it's best to get some sleep.
Puts Nick Robinson's 16 hours straight to shame, doesn't it? That?
Well, we did actually do, I think we've done the longest ever continuous election. I mean, Dimbleby tends to kind of fade out. Sort of 5 a.m. I mean, we've actually done continuous from,
right.
And also we tend to start early. We start at 9. So I've certainly done. I think I had one occasion I did 9 to 11 actually in the election chair.
What is that like? How do you get through it?
Well, it's easy if what's happening is interesting. I mean, the great enemy. I mean, one of the great reasons I always think for being a journalist is it's one of the few jobs where something being boring is a good reason not to do it. That you said, well, that's boring, no one wants to hear about that, so you don't do it. So that's an attraction of the job, but if it gets boring, then that's when your eyelids start to droop a bit. And there's always, with election nights, there's always it's slightly better now that the exit polls have got so good, but you get your exit poll at 10 o'clock, and actually you don't really start getting any serious results till well after 1 a.m. And so you can't really tell if the exit poll's right or the direction of how things are going.
I think satirical publications such as Spitting Image have depicted those in your profession as pigs. Is that unfair?
Look, well, it goes back to what I say. I mean, you do have to be prepared to wallow in other people's foibles and mistakes. and all the rest of it. And when things go wrong, there can be a bit of a feeding frenzy, I suppose. I mean, sharks is another analogy, but I think I do think you have to be. And most of the journalists, whether in print or the electronic media that I know, I mean, you have to be wary about being too close to the politicians. I mean, you have to be prepared to call a spade, yes. To turn on them. So, when things go wrong, they may think that you're being pigs or hyenas or whatever. But I mean, certainly, one of the key roles of journalism is to ask serious questions about all aspects of what people in power are doing.
Yeah. And finally, how do you switch off from politics and relax? I
mean, I'm not one of those people who, because I'm working for a 24-hour news organisation, I have to pretty much be aware of what's going on. But I'm not one of those people, of which there are a lot in the world of politics, whose kind of hobbies are, reading books about politics and, or even, being involved in politics or non-governmental organisations. I mean, I have wide set of interests, mainly on the kind of cultural side. My first degree was in English literature, so I still like reading books. I like films, I like theatre, I like the cinema. I've got an ever-expanding family. I like gardening. That's what I do. I'm not honestly very interested in sport, although I force myself to go to the gym.
Although you wear rugby socks.
Well, I wear rugby socks. Well, I like long socks because if you cross your legs, you don't want to see that triangle of flesh. Harold Wilson did some interviews after he left office.
Yeah.
I can't remember who they're with, and they're entirely spoilt because, to me, you're just mesmerised by this sort of piggy bit of flesh at the bottom of his trousers. So I try and avoid that. Wear long socks.
Yeah, and how much time do you get off?
One of the things about Sky News, which is probably why one of the reasons I've been able to work for it for so long, is that there's a recognition that provided you're there when then you're needed, they're not too concerned about you clock watching. So it varies very much. That during an election, I probably don't have a day off. And of course, it never ends with the election, because as soon as the election ends, you've got the formation of the government and the new government. So probably for about a 2-month period, I probably don't have a day off. But other times, there's plenty of time to make it up.
Adam Boulton, really appreciate your time. Thank you very much indeed.
Cheers.